No one in Alder's Valley had dared touch the Virgin Mary statue until Elias Marrow did. The town of St. Alder's had a silence that seemed to seep into its bones. For years, the church bell at the hilltop chapel had not rung. The once thriving fields that fed the valley had grown tired, their colors fading like an old photograph. On the edge of town, Elias Marrow worked his land with the stubbornness of his forefathers. His father had always told him that the soil of Alder's Valley was blessed because of the Virgin Mary statue that stood at the corner of their field. Weather-worn and moss-cloaked, the statue faced east, her hands folded, eyes lifted toward the heavens. But Elias didn't see blessing anymore. He saw rot. Every season his yields shrank. Every winter the family scraped by thinner. His wife, Clara, bore the lines of worry around her mouth, and his son, little Jonah, had started coughing whenever the wind grew cold. The neighbors whispered that Elias's land was cursed, and each time he caught their words, he clenched his jaw tighter. "It's that statue," Elias muttered one evening, looking out at the pale figure under the moonlight, standing there like a ghost, watching, waiting. If it were truly holy, wouldn't it have helped us by now? Clara hesitated, sewing by the hearth. "Your grandfather placed it there for a reason. He made a promise. Something about the bell." "I know the story," Elias cut her off. "He vowed to ring the chapel bell every harvest in thanks. But he's been gone 20 years. That promise doesn't bind me." Clara said nothing. But the fire popped sharply in the silence, as though disagreeing. The next morning, Elias rose before dawn, hitched the oxen, and dragged the statue from its resting place. The stone ground against soil with a groan, as if it disliked being moved. By noon, he had set it against the back barn wall, half hidden by tools and straw. When he returned to the field, the earth seemed strangely quiet, the air heavy. Even the crows perched on the fence posts looked uneasy. That night, the wind shifted. The corn leaves rustled, though no breeze moved. Jonah woke screaming that someone had been standing at his window, hands folded, eyes hollow. Clara rushed to him, whispering prayers, while Elias sat on the edge of the bed, his skin prickling with a fear he refused to name. 3 days later, the first blight appeared. Whole stalks of corn yellowed overnight, collapsing as though drained of life. The well water grew murky with a bitter taste. And in town, old Father Rowan murmured in his homily, "A promise once made before the mother is not so easily broken." Elias clenched his fists, telling himself it was coincidence. But deep inside, where the memory of his grandfather's voice still lingered, unease began to grow. The bell on the chapel hill remained silent. Yet in the valley below, a different sound whispered through the nights, faint, almost like stone shifting against stone. And Elias wondered, for the first time, if he had made a terrible mistake. The nights in Alder's Valley grew heavier after the statue's removal. A strange hush clung to the fields, as though the earth itself held its breath. Elias Marrow, 38 years old, lay awake in the farmhouse, listening to the wind drag across the shutters. Sleep never came easy anymore. Every time his eyes closed, he heard that faint scrape, like stone shifting against stone, somewhere out in the barn. Clara, 35, stirred beside him. "You're not resting," she whispered. "There's nothing to rest for," Elias replied, rubbing his temples. "The fields are dying. I've lost near a quarter of the corn already. If I can't bring in a harvest..." His voice cracked, though he tried to hide it. Her hand slipped onto his. "Maybe we should take the statue back. Your grandfather..." "Don't!" Elias snapped, more harshly than he intended. "It's a lump of stone, nothing more. If this farm dies, it won't be because of some statue." Yet even as he said it, the words rang hollow. The next morning, 12-year-old Jonah refused to leave his bed. His face was pale, his eyes shadowed. "It was outside again," he whispered, when his mother asked what troubled him. "The lady. She doesn't like the barn." Elias stiffened. "You dreamed it, boy. Just a dream." But when he went to the barn later that day, something made his blood run cold. The tools he had stacked against the wall were scattered across the floor, the rake bent as though crushed under weight, and the Virgin Mary statue, though he was certain he had left it pressed to the wall, stood inches forward, its face tilted toward the door. "No," Elias hissed under his breath. He gripped the statue by its cold stone shoulders, shoving it back in place. "You don't move. You can't move." That night the cornfields came alive. Leaves rattled though the air was still. Clara woke to the sound of distant crying, faint and mournful, as though it drifted from the chapel hill. Jonah trembled in his sleep, whispering, "The bell. The bell won't ring." By the week's end, Elias's farm looked near ruined. Whole rows of corn lay flattened. The well was fouled, and neighbors crossed themselves when they passed his land, their eyes darting to the barn as though afraid to linger too long. At Sunday Mass, old Father Rowan, 72 years old, fixed Elias with his weary gaze. "Your grandfather was a man of his word," the priest said softly after service. "He vowed that each harvest the bell would ring in thanksgiving." The valley remembers Elias. The mother remembers. Elias clenched his jaw. And what if the bell hasn't rung because God no longer listens? The priest's reply was quiet but steady. Then perhaps it is because man has forgotten to keep faith. That night, when Elias returned home, he found Jonah at the window again, wide-eyed and trembling. "She's there," Jonah whispered. "She's waiting." And though Elias dared not look, he felt it, the weight of unseen eyes upon his land, heavy as the silence of a bell that refused to sound. By late autumn, Elias Marrow's land was near barren. The once vibrant stalks of corn drooped like withered skeletons, their husks brittle, their color the shade of ash. The townsfolk no longer came by with offers of help. Instead, they crossed themselves when passing the farm, whispering that Elias had stirred something that should never have been touched. Inside the farmhouse, the air was no better. Clara grew thinner, worry carving deep shadows under her eyes. Jonah's cough worsened, rattling his 12-year-old chest until each breath sounded like a struggle. Elias, now worn and unshaven, felt the weight of failure pressing upon him, yet pride kept him from bending, until the night the barn door slammed open on its own. Elias rushed out with a lantern, the cold biting at his face. The Virgin Mary statue stood in the center of the barn, though he swore it had been wedged tight against the wall. Around it, the tools lay scattered like offerings thrown in haste. His lantern flame sputtered, and the sound came again, stone against stone, slow and deliberate. Then, faintly, from the hilltop chapel, came the echo of a bell. Except the bell had not been rung in over 15 years. Elias staggered back. No, it can't be. Clara appeared behind him, her face pale in the lamplight. "Elias, maybe it's not a curse. Maybe it's a reminder. The promise wasn't kept. Your grandfather's vow." He shook his head, but his eyes burned. He remembered being a boy, watching his grandfather ring that old bronze bell after every harvest. The sound had rolled across the valley like sunlight itself, carrying gratitude into every home. And he remembered the last time he heard it, the year before his grandfather died. The promise had died with him. Now the valley suffered. That night, Jonah's fever climbed. His skin burned hot, his small body trembling, as though some unseen hand pressed down upon him. Clara wept quietly at his bedside, whispering prayers that grew more desperate by the hour, and Elias could no longer deny it. Before dawn, he saddled the horse and rode hard toward the chapel hill. The air was sharp, the valley cloaked in mist. He reached the weathered wooden door, its hinges creaking as though waking from a long sleep. Inside, the chapel was dark, the altar bare but for wax stubs of long-dead candles. Dust lay thick across the pews, but the bell rope hung there still. Elias gripped it with both hands, his knuckles white. Tears blurred his vision. "Forgive me," he whispered into the silence. "Forgive me for forgetting." And with every ounce of strength, he pulled. The bell groaned, then thundered to life. Its sound rolled down the valley, deep and resonant, a voice long denied now breaking through. Again and again Elias pulled, the vibrations shaking the chapel walls. And as the final note faded, the silence of Alder's Valley seemed to lift, like a shadow retreating before dawn. He fell to his knees, breathless. The air around him felt lighter, almost holy. When he returned home at sunrise, the first thing he saw was Clara at the doorway, tears shining on her face. Jonah stood beside her, weak but upright. Color returned to his cheeks. "The fever broke," Clara whispered. Behind them, in the barn, the Virgin Mary statue had returned to its rightful place at the field's edge. Facing east, her stone gaze lifted once more toward the heavens, and in the distance, the bell still echoed faintly, as though promising it would not be silent again. For the first time in years, the valley awoke to a new sound, the chapel bell ringing, its echo rolling through the hills like a long-lost hymn. Neighbors paused in their chores, lifting their heads in wonder. Some crossed themselves, some wept quietly, and others whispered, "The promise has been kept." At the Marrow farm, the change was swift and startling. The blighted stalks that had hung lifeless now seemed to stretch a little taller. The bitter taste in the well water began to fade. The air itself felt gentler, carrying the faint perfume of wildflowers that had not bloomed in seasons. Elias, 38, walked the boundary of his land with Jonah at his side. The boy's cough had eased, his voice steadier, though he still clung to his father's arm. "Did you really ring the bell?" Jonah asked, eyes wide with childlike awe. Elias looked toward the chapel on the hill, its silhouette crowned by the morning sun. "Yes, son, and I'll ring it every year, just as your great-grandfather did. It's not the statue that was ever cursed. It was us forgetting our word." Clara, 35, stood in the doorway, her hands folded. She had not spoken much since Jonah's fever broke, but her smile told Elias what words could not. That evening, Elias returned the statue to its rightful place at the edge of the field. He brushed the moss from her stone robe and set fresh flowers at her feet. For a long while he stood there, the twilight painting the sky in shades of gold and violet. The valley was quiet, but not the same suffocating quiet of before. This silence carried peace. Elias bowed his head. "We remember now," he whispered, "and we will not forget again." As he turned back toward the farmhouse, the faint sound of the bell drifted once more on the wind, though no hand touched its rope. It was not loud, not startling, just a soft chime, like a whisper of grace reminding the valley that promises matter. Faith endures, and silence need not mean absence. And from that day on, each harvest ended not with dread, but with the ringing of the chapel bell, a sound that carried hope across Alder's Valley, binding generations to a vow that would not be broken again. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs a whisper of grace today.